The UK is still going through the transition period, which lasts a year. So if you're a normal citizen going backwards and forwards between Europe and the UK, although the UK geographically, of course, is still part of Europe. Nothing has changed and won't change until December. At the same time, the real debate is now starting, which is not on how do we leave the EU, that's done, but how do we re-engage with the EU in terms of the future relationship. Those talks will start in March. They have to finish by the end of the year, so they're going to be pretty intense. And the real question, of course, is what kind of final Brexit outcome are we going to have? Is it going to be a hard Brexit where the UK turns its back on Europe and tries to find a new relationship with the rest of the world? Or will economic and other sort of interests prevail, and that the UK will decide that its interests lie with the closest possible association with Europe in trade, in defence and security? And frankly, the jury is still out on that, because it's all going to come out of the negotiations. And as you can imagine, the UK is still very much divided between Remainers and Brexiteers. The Brexiteers, of course, are hoping for a minimal relationship with Brussels, which will leave the UK fully free, as they see it, to form new relations with the rest of the world. The Remain camp is hoping, again, the economic interests, security interests will prevail, and that as the negotiations proceed, there'll be more realism in the UK, and we'll end up with something like Norway or something like Switzerland, not membership, but still a very, very close working relationship. Let's see. Ask me this question in 1 year. Well, for the time being, as the UK likes to say, it's leaving the EU, but it's not leaving Europe, and therefore not much is going to change from one day to the next. The UK obviously is still remaining in NATO, which is very popular in the UK. In fact, at a time when NATO's popularity has gone down in a number of countries, including the United States, interestingly, it's gone up in the UK, because clearly it's the only game in town now for UK security. So the UK is doubling down on NATO and has an interest, of course, in keeping the Americans involved in NATO and in maintaining NATO as the most important organisation that it possibly can. The more important NATO is, the more important the UK security role in Europe becomes, the more influence the UK will have. At the same time, the UK is aware that the EU is ramping up its defence efforts because of Brexit, yes, but also because of the doubts about the American commitment. Does President Trump really believe in defending Europe? Obviously, a great power competition from Russia, China, and in Brussels, on the non-NATO side of town, the EU side of town, there's a lot of activity at the moment. A lot of technical jargon, PESCO, European Defence Fund, coordinated annual review of European defence, but it all means pooling and sharing European capabilities more to have a more integrated European effort with a defence industrial policy, lots of new acquisition programmes, lots of more money being spent. And so the UK faces a difficult choice. Does it just put all of its eggs in the NATO basket, or does it sort of believe that something's going to happen with European defence? And even if the UK is not a EU member any longer, nonetheless, as a very close neighbour, it should somehow or other participate in some of these programs, because it may want to join the French in Africa, it may want to join the Italians in Libya, it may want to help out between Greece and Turkey in the Mediterranean, and because also the British defence industry, Britain has got a lot of big defence contractors, they want a slice of the pie when it comes to the research and development and some of the new capability programs. So again, ask me that question in a year, and we'll see if it's just NATO or if the UK is also interested in some of these European defence efforts as well. The UK talks about resurrecting global Britain, although personally I doubt if we can go back to the British Empire in the 19th century. I think, thank God, and I think the rest of the world will believe that as well, that those days of empire covering 25% of the land surface of the world, those days are over. And so Britain will have to carefully pick and choose its partners according to its economic and security interests. Obviously, the United States will be a key partner because the UK traditionally think of Afghanistan, Iraq, has worked closely on everything with the United States. But if the US is now focusing on the Asia Pacific rather than on Europe, will the UK really see its interests in going along with the US to put all of its aircraft carriers and frigates in Asia? I'm not so certain, particularly when, if you look at lots of the contemporary issues like buying Huawei technology, whether you support the nuclear deal on Iran, the UK is siding more with the Europeans than with the United States. So let's see if it can have a wholly US policy. Of course, there are important Commonwealth countries. One thinks of India, one thinks of Australia, one thinks of New Zealand, and I think the UK obviously will want secure economic relationships with them. But whether the UK is really prepared to take on a role in their security, I'm not so sure. I mean, my own view, for whatever it's worth, is that the global Britain bubble would be burst rather quickly, and we'll recognise that on the core issues, Africa, the Middle East, terrorism, illegal migration, organised crime, all of these kind of things, we face exactly the same problems as our French neighbours, just 20 miles across the Channel, and even if we're not in the EU, we should be part of the overall European effort to secure the European neighbourhood. It's no good going global if your immediate neighbourhood is on fire and if you've got hundreds of illegal immigrants arriving on your shores every day of the week. I certainly think that they see the UK as still a major actor, which is reassuring in a kind of way, because yes, it is the sixth largest economy in the world. It's a member of the UN Security Council. It's a nuclear power. It does have, beyond the EU, we mentioned the Commonwealth, lots of old links, even if maybe they're not as strong as they were in the days of the British Empire. The special relationship with the United States, with many other countries of the world. So I think there is a real concern that, the Brexit doesn't sort of harm the ability of the UK and Europe to work together productively in terms of stability. You think of Africa, you think of the Middle East, you think of the conflict in Ukraine at the moment, you think of dealing with terrorism and all of these kind of things, and somehow it's all going to have a happy end or a softer landing. But I think they're also aware that the UK is sort of moving into a totally unknown destination. And one question that did come up is the impact on the British economy and whether the UK in the future will have the economic base and the finance to sustain all of these great ambitions, but also whether the Europeans will be able, without the UK and the 25% of military capabilities that the UK brings to Europe, to really develop their own sort of European Defence Union by themselves. A lot of people said to me, the Europeans often blamed the UK in the past for lack of progress on European defence because the Brits didn't really support that. But now that the UK is gone, will they really together have the political will to move forward, or was the UK simply a convenient alibi for a European defence that they also didn't really believe them in? And so to some degree this is going to be the moment of truth, not just for the UK but for the desire of the Europeans to push to a closer defence union as well.